Adele did not arrive at Asheville Manor quietly. The wooden cart that carried her from the village station had a broken rear wheel, and it rattled so loudly against the gravel drive that 3 footmen turned from their duties at the front steps to watch it approach. The horse pulling the cart looked as though it had given up hope somewhere around the 3rd mile. The driver, an old man named Harold who smelled of pipe tobacco and had not spoken a single word during the entire journey, pulled the reins without ceremony and stopped the cart in the middle of the drive without pulling it to the side the way he was supposed to. Adele climbed down before he offered a hand. She had one bag. It was a brown leather bag, cracked along both sides of the handle, and it held 2 dresses, a pair of working boots, a small tin of sewing needles, and a letter. The letter was the most important thing she owned, not because of what it said, but because of what it did not say. It introduced her to the household staff at Asheville Manor as a reliable worker with 3 years of domestic service behind her. It did not mention where exactly those 3 years had been spent. It did not mention the name of the family she had worked for before. It gave her age as 32 and described her constitution as strong and her character as quiet. All of that was more or less true. She stood at the base of the front steps and looked up at the house. Asheville Manor was not the largest estate she had ever seen. That would have been Brennan Hall in the north, where she had passed 2 weeks once helping with preparations for a wedding that was eventually cancelled. But Asheville had something Brennan Hall did not, which was a kind of deliberate weight to it, a gravity that came not from its size but from the darkness of its stone. It was built from dark gray limestone that had turned almost black in the wet weather. The windows were tall and narrow. The front door was oak, stained nearly as dark as the stone around it. Even in the morning light, which was pale and thin the way October light always was in that part of England, the house looked like it was absorbing the sky rather than reflecting it. One of the footmen came down the steps. He was young, perhaps 20, with the kind of complexion that flushed easily, and was currently flushing from the effort of pretending not to have been staring. He said his name was George. He would take her bag to the servants' entrance around the east side of the building. Mrs. Pratt, the head housekeeper, was expecting her. She should follow him. Adele followed him. The servants' entrance was narrow and low, the kind of door designed to remind everyone who used it that they were entering a different version of the house than the one with the tall windows and the oak front door. She ducked slightly, though she did not need to. The corridor beyond was stone-floored and cold and smelled of lye soap, and something underneath the lye soap that she recognized after a moment as old dampness, the particular smell of a house that was very old and very large and could not quite be kept entirely dry no matter how much effort was put into it. Mrs. Pratt was waiting in the housekeeper's room off the main servants' corridor. She was a small woman, which Adele had not expected from the authority of her presence. She was perhaps 60, with gray hair pinned so tightly that it seemed to be pulling her forehead smooth. She wore a black dress with small buttons up the front, and she had a ring of keys on her belt that caught the light from the single lamp on her desk. She looked at Adele the way a farmer looks at a horse before deciding whether to buy it, not rudely, just carefully. She asked for the letter. Adele gave it to her. Mrs. Pratt read it twice, not quickly. She read it the way people read documents when they are looking for something between the words, something the writer left out. After the second reading, she folded it precisely along its original creases and set it on the desk and looked at Adele again. She said the letter was brief. Adele said she supposed it was. Mrs. Pratt said she had sent word to the address listed in the letter 6 days ago and had not received a reply. Adele said that was probably because the family had left the country in September, for health reasons. She said this in the tone of someone who found this fact unfortunate but not particularly surprising, and she held Mrs. Pratt's gaze without difficulty. There was a silence that lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then Mrs. Pratt said that she would need someone reliable for the east wing. 6 rooms, 12 windows, the corridor between the library and the main staircase, and 3 of the guest rooms that were currently empty but needed to be kept in condition regardless. The hours were 5:30 in the morning until 7 in the evening, with a break at noon and Sunday afternoons free. The pay was what the letter had stated. The room she would sleep in was small but clean. She would share the upstairs servants' bathroom with 2 other maids, a girl named Lucy and a girl named Maud. Adele said that was acceptable. Mrs. Pratt said there was one more thing. She described it without looking away from Adele in the same even tone she had used for everything else. There was a corridor at the far end of the east wing. It led to the Duke's private study. That corridor and that room were not part of Adele's duties. She was not to enter that corridor alone. She was not to enter it at all unless directly instructed to do so. On Thursdays, Mrs. Pratt herself cleaned the study, and she did so alone, and she did not require assistance. Adele asked if there was a reason. Mrs. Pratt said the Duke valued his privacy. Adele said she understood. She did not ask again. She had learned over the years that the questions worth asking were the ones you could ask directly, and that the answers worth having were the ones given without being pulled. Mrs. Pratt's answer had the quality of a door that was closed but not locked. Adele noted it and moved on. She was shown to her room by Lucy, who was 19 and cheerful in the uncomplicated way of someone who had not yet been given reasons to be otherwise. The room was on the third floor of the servants' quarters, which meant it was at the top of the house where the ceilings sloped and the windows were small. But it was clean as Mrs. Pratt had promised. The bed had a good mattress. The single wardrobe had 3 wire hangers and smelled faintly of cedar. There was a small wooden chair and a washstand with a blue and white ceramic basin, and the window looked out over the kitchen garden, which in October was mostly bare earth with a few stubborn rows of leeks. Lucy said the garden was nicer in summer. She said the cook, Mrs. Holt, was strict but fair and always left something warm in the kitchen if you came in late from your duties. She said the other maid, Maud, was quiet but kind and would show her the proper way to do the east wing windows because the frames on the second-floor windows had a trick to them and would stick if you went at them the wrong way. Adele thanked her and unpacked her bag. She hung the 2 dresses in the wardrobe. She set the tin of sewing needles on the windowsill. She folded the letter carefully and put it under the mattress, which was not the most original hiding place, but was a reliable one. Then she sat on the edge of the bed for a moment and looked at the window and at the bare garden below and at the pale gray sky beyond it. She had been in other rooms like this one, many of them. She was good at arriving at new rooms and making them feel temporary in a way that was useful, because temporary meant she was not required to belong to them, only to use them. She had learned to think of this as a skill rather than a loss. It was, she had decided, a practical way to live. She went downstairs to start work. The east wing was exactly as described. 6 rooms, 12 windows, the corridor. The rooms were guest rooms and a sitting room, and a small morning room with an east-facing window that would have let in good early light if the sky had been clear. Everything was clean enough, but needed the particular attention that came from regular maintenance rather than periodic effort. She could see where the dusting had been done adequately rather than thoroughly, where the window glass had been wiped in circles rather than strokes, where the corners of the baseboards had been skipped because they required kneeling. She did not skip them. The work steadied her, it always had. There was something about the physical rhythm of it, the movement from surface to surface with purpose and method that cleared her mind in a way that little else did. She was not a woman who thought of herself as someone whose mind needed clearing, but it did, sometimes, and work was how she did it. She met Maud that evening at supper. Maud was perhaps 35, thin, with careful eyes and a way of listening that made you feel she was absorbing what you said rather than simply waiting for you to finish. She showed Adele the window trick the next morning. The frames on the second-floor guest rooms did indeed stick, but if you pressed at the left corner with your thumb before turning the latch, they opened cleanly. Maud had figured this out in her first month at Asheville and had been doing it ever since. Adele filed it away. The days settled into their rhythm. She was good at rhythms. Up before 5, downstairs by 1:30, the east wing done by noon, the afternoon spent on whatever Mrs. Pratt assigned from the general housekeeping duties that covered the shared spaces. She was quiet at meals, which people at first mistook for shyness and later understood was simply economy. She said what she needed to say and no more. She was polite to everyone, including the footmen who were sometimes not polite back, and she did her work without complaint. She noticed things. This was not something she tried to do. It was simply how her mind operated. She noticed that Lucy cried quietly some evenings in the room next to hers, not loudly enough to bring attention, but clearly enough that the sound came through the thin wall. She noticed that the senior footman, a man named Albert, who carried himself with the importance of a man who had held the same position for 20 years, and intended to hold it for 20 more, walked differently on Thursdays than on other days of the week. On Thursdays he was careful near the east corridor. She noticed that Mrs. Pratt always arrived at the study door with her keys already selected, the right one already separated from the ring, meaning she had made the choice before she reached the corridor, meaning she thought about it in advance, meaning it required some kind of preparation. She noticed the Duke. Not because she sought to. The nature of her duties meant that she rarely saw him directly. He moved through the main part of the house on a schedule that the staff had learned to work around, the way you learn to work around any fixed and powerful thing. He took breakfast in the small dining room at 7. He was in his study from 8 until noon. He walked in the grounds in the afternoon. He dined alone in the main dining room at 7:30 in the evening, and the dinner service was handled by Albert and the younger footman whose name was Owen and who had not yet developed Albert's walk. She saw the Duke twice in her first 2 weeks. The first time was at the end of the east corridor, where he appeared from the direction of his study while she was still 20 feet away. He was tall, perhaps 60 years old, with gray hair that was still thick and a posture that was very straight in the way of a man who had been told his whole life to stand straight, and had done it long enough that it was no longer effort. He wore a dark coat and carried a book in his left hand. He looked at her with the brief, acknowledging look that a man in his position gave to members of his household staff and continued walking. She pressed herself to the side of the corridor, as was proper. He walked past without another glance. The second time was from the morning room window. She was doing the glass when she saw him below in the grounds, walking the long path that ran along the south side of the house. He walked with his hands behind his back. He walked slowly. He stopped once and looked at something in the border garden. She could not see what he was looking at. He stood there for some time and then continued. She did not find these observations significant. They were simply part of what she noticed. What she found significant, though she would not have used that word for it yet, was the corridor itself. Not its contents, which she could only imagine, but the quality of it, the way it felt different from the other corridors in the East Wing. The other corridors were service corridors, functional, cold in winter and somewhat warmer in summer, with dark wainscoting and plain runner carpets that had faded to a uniform gray-brown over decades of foot traffic. They smelled of the house in the ordinary way. Old stone, furniture, wax, the faint residue of coal fires. The corridor that led to the Duke's study smelled different. She noticed this on her 4th day, when she was doing the adjacent corridor and came close enough to the boundary that the door at the end of the permitted corridor opened slightly in the draft from the window she had just cleaned. The door did not open far, perhaps 3 inches, but the air that came through it was warmer and had a different quality to it, the way air in a room with many books has a different quality, paper and leather and something else underneath those things, not an unpleasant smell. A complicated one. She had been about to push the door closed again, because that was the correct and obvious thing to do, when she became aware of Mrs. Pratt standing at the other end of the corridor watching her. Adele pushed the door closed. She stepped back. She said nothing because there was nothing to say that was not already understood by both of them. Mrs. Pratt said, in a voice that was neither loud nor soft, that the draft from the windows could pull doors open. Adele said yes. Mrs. Pratt said that it was best to keep the east corridor windows closed when doing the adjacent rooms. Adele said she would remember that. Mrs. Pratt held her gaze for a moment longer than was required for the exchange they had just had. Then she turned and walked away, her keys catching the light with each step. Adele stood very still in the corridor. She was not frightened, she was not alarmed. She was the thing she had learned to be when she felt the particular pull of a thing she was not supposed to look at, which was careful. She was very, very careful. She went back to her windows. The weeks passed. October became November. The grounds went gray and the morning frosts came in, and the kitchen windows steamed from the inside during the breakfast preparation so that by the time Adele passed them on her way to the east wing the glass was opaque and warm to the touch. She learned the house. She learned its sounds and its particular silences, which were different things. She learned which floorboards on the main staircase announced your weight and which ones did not. She learned that Mrs. Holt kept a pot of strong tea on the range from 6 in the morning until 11, and that if you wanted good tea after 11 you had to make it yourself, which Maud always did at 1/4 past, in a small blue pot she kept on a shelf above her designated hook in the servants' cloakroom. She learned that Lucy's crying had nothing to do with Asheville. It had to do with a boy in the village. Maud told her this in the practical tone of a woman who had watched Lucy go through this same cycle twice before and expected it to resolve itself the way it always did, which was with the boy eventually doing something predictable and Lucy eventually recovering her fundamental cheerfulness, and the whole episode settling into memory. She learned that Albert had worked at Asheville for 23 years, and that he regarded this length of service as both his greatest achievement and the central fact of his identity, in a way that made her feel something she could not quite name. Not pity, something adjacent to it. The feeling you got watching a person who had arranged themselves entirely around a single thing. She learned that the Duke did not receive guests. There had been, according to Maud, a period some years back when the house had been more active, a social season or two, dinners with county families, but that had changed. Maud did not know why. She had not been at Asheville during that period. She had heard it from a woman who had since moved to a position in London, and second-hand information had a way of losing its shape, and she said all of this in the careful way of someone who was not going to speculate beyond what she actually knew. Adele listened. She was always listening. It was the thing she did instead of asking. On a Wednesday evening in late November, 6 weeks after her arrival, she was coming down the main staircase from the upper floor where she had been replacing the oil in the landing lamp, and she heard something from the direction of the east corridor that she had not heard before. It was a sound that she could not immediately identify, not a voice, not footsteps, something quieter and less directed than either of those things. She stopped on the staircase. The sound came again. It was, she realized after a moment, music, very faint, as though coming through two walls rather than one. A piano, played slowly and with the particular quality of someone who was playing for themselves rather than for anyone else. She stood on the staircase and listened until it stopped, which it did after perhaps 4 minutes, mid-phrase, without resolution, as if the person playing had simply decided to stop rather than reach the end of what they were playing. Then the house was quiet again. She went down the rest of the stairs and back to the servants' corridor and said nothing about it to anyone. But she thought about it later that evening, in her room with the bare garden below the window and the thin sound of Lucy turning in her bed on the other side of the wall. She lay in the dark and thought about a man who lived alone in a house this size, who refused guests, who kept a room locked against his own staff, who played the piano for 4 minutes and then stopped. She thought about the smell of that room, books and leather and the other thing underneath. She thought about Mrs. Pratt's keys, always selected in advance, always ready. She turned onto her side and closed her eyes. She had learned, over years of living in other people's houses, that the most important things about a place were never the things you were shown on the first day. The most important things revealed themselves slowly, like water finding its way through stone. You did not rush them, you did not go looking. You simply stayed, and you paid attention, and eventually the house told you what it was. Asheville Manor was telling her something, she did not yet know what. She was patient. She had always been patient. It was the one thing that had never failed her. She closed her eyes and the house settled around her with its particular sounds, the wind against the narrow windows, the distant shift and tick of old stonework finding its place in the cold, and she lay still in the dark and listened to all of it until sleep came, which it did not do quickly but did do eventually, the way most things she waited for did. Edmund Hargrove, the 4th Duke of Cheshire, had a habit that his valet of 15 years, a careful man named Charles, had never once commented on, which was the only reason Charles had remained his valet for 15 years. The habit was this. At some point between 10 in the evening and midnight, the Duke would leave his bedroom, walk the back corridor to the east wing, unlock the study door, sit in the large chair by the window and remain there for an undetermined length of time before returning to bed. He did not light the main lamp. He sometimes lit the small lamp on the side table, the one with the green glass shade, and he sometimes did not. He brought nothing with him and he took nothing back. Charles knew this because Charles had, early in his tenure, heard the Duke leave his room during the night and had gone to investigate, thinking he was unwell. He had found the study door locked. He had stood outside it for long enough to understand that this was deliberate and private, and not something he was meant to witness. And then he had gone back to bed, and he had never mentioned it to anyone, not in 15 years, not even to Mrs. Pratt, whom he trusted as much as he trusted anyone in the house. The Duke was not, in Charles's assessment, an unhappy man. He was a contained one. There was a difference, and it was important. An unhappy man leaked his unhappiness into everything around him. The Duke leaked nothing. He moved through his house and his days with a consistency that Charles found, if he was honest about it, somewhat admirable. Whatever he carried it entirely on his own. This was not a quality Charles particularly wanted to emulate, but it was a quality he recognized. The new maid, the one in the east wing who had arrived with a cracked leather bag and a letter from a family that apparently no longer existed at the address listed, had not yet been assigned a name in Charles's private taxonomy of the household. He gave everyone a name, not a cruel one, simply identifying one the way a naturalist gives names to things they are observing. Mrs. Pratt was the anchor, Albert was the monument, Lucy was the spring. The new maid was not yet anything. She was, for now, simply a presence he had not yet understood. He had seen her twice, once on the back stairs, once in the kitchen passage. Both times she had been moving with the particular economy of someone who knew exactly where they were going and did not feel the need to announce it. That was relatively rare. Most people in his observation moved through shared spaces with a small amount of excess motion, a slight openness to being stopped, being noticed. The new maid moved as if being noticed was not something she had accounted for. He found this interesting. He also found interesting the fact that Mrs. Pratt had mentioned her to him, which was unusual. Mrs. Pratt managed the household staff with complete authority and briefed him only on matters that required his direct knowledge. The new maid did not, as far as Charles could tell, require his direct knowledge. But Mrs. Pratt had said, when passing him in the upper corridor 3 days after the new woman's arrival, that the new maid was very thorough and that her east wing windows had not looked that clean since the summer. It was not a significant thing to say. But Mrs. Pratt did not say insignificant things. Charles had filed this away and continued about his duties, the fire in the Duke's bedroom, the morning coat brushed and hung, the correspondence sorted on the writing desk in the order the Duke preferred, which was by return urgency rather than by sender, a distinction that Charles had taken several months to learn and that the Duke had never directly explained, which meant Charles had learned it by observation rather than instruction. Everything important at Asheville was learned by observation. He was beginning to think the new maid understood this. He was beginning to think she had understood it before she arrived. The east wing settled into its daily quiet again by mid-December. The guest rooms were empty, as they had been since Adele's arrival. The morning room was used occasionally by the Duke when he wanted a different window for reading, which was, by Adele's count, twice in 6 weeks. Both times she had been in the adjacent corridor, and had heard the door open, and had waited quietly until she heard it close again before continuing her work. She had added the piano to her mental map of the house. It was a Thursday evening habit, not a Wednesday one. She had been wrong about that in the beginning. She had heard it on a Wednesday the first time, but that had been, she later understood, because she had been in the wrong part of the house for the right Wednesday sounds and had only been in the right place to hear it on the other days by accident. On Thursdays, after Mrs. Pratt's cleaning of the study, the Duke sometimes played, always in the evening, always briefly, never to the end of the piece. She had heard it 4 times now. She thought about it in the way you think about a thing you have decided not to investigate. That is to say, she thought about it constantly, but she did not act on it. She cleaned her 6 rooms and her 12 windows. She kept her end of the corridor in the condition Mrs. Pratt expected. She ate her meals and slept her nights and watched the winter deepen outside the kitchen garden window. And she waited. She did not know what she was waiting for. She would know it when it arrived. She was, as she had always been, patient as stone. The frost that came in the 2nd week of December was the kind that did not lift during the day. It stayed in the ground and in the stone, and in the corners of windows where the glazing had gone thin with age. The servants wore their coats to breakfast, and the fires in the guest rooms had to be lit even though no guests were expected, simply to prevent the damp from setting into the plaster walls. This added to the morning duties, and Mrs. Pratt adjusted the schedule accordingly, which meant Adele was in earlier and staying later, and covering a wider portion of the east wing than she had in the warmer weeks. She did not complain. She also noticed that the adjustment in schedule put her closer to the restricted corridor than she had been before, because the rooms adjacent to it were the ones that required the most attention against the damp. The wainscoting in the 2nd room along had a long horizontal crack near the bottom that wept moisture in cold weather, and it needed wiping twice daily or the dampness would spread to the plasterwork above it. This meant that twice a day she walked past the door at the far end of her permitted territory, and twice a day she did not look at it directly, the way you do not look directly at something you are very aware of. The door was always closed. She began to notice details about it that she had not noticed before, simply from proximity. The door was oak, like the front door, but older. The handle was brass and had the dull finish of brass that had been polished for decades, not bright but warm. Keyhole was large, the old-fashioned kind, and the key that Mrs. Pratt used to open it was long and heavy, the kind made for locks built at a time when locks were made to last generations rather than years. At the base of the door, where it met the stone floor of the corridor, there was a small gap of perhaps half an inch, not enough to see through, but enough on Thursday evenings after Mrs. Pratt had been in the room and the fireplace inside was lit to let a thin line of warm light into the corridor. She had not planned to notice this. She had been on her knees, wiping the wainscoting crack one Thursday evening, and she had looked up, and there it was, a line of amber light along the floor at the base of the door. She knelt there and looked at it for a moment. Then she finished wiping the wainscoting and stood up and went back to the servants' corridor. She did not mention it to Maud. She did not mention it to Lucy, who would have found it exciting in all the wrong ways. She did not mention it to anyone. The following Thursday was the day Mrs. Pratt fell ill. It came on quickly, the way real illness always did, not with the gradual warning of a thing you could prepare for, but with a sudden force that left no room for arrangement. She was at the breakfast table in the servants' hall at 6:30 in the morning, and by 6:45 she was visibly unwell, and by 7 she was in her room, and the estate surgeon, a young man named Dr. William Parks, who had taken over the practice from his retired father, had been sent for. He came by 8. He said it was a fever. He said she should rest. He gave instructions to Mrs. Holt about keeping her warm and ensuring she drank sufficient water, and he said with the confidence of a young man who had been a doctor for less time than he looked that she should be recovered within the week. The household reorganized itself around her absence with the particular efficiency of a staff that had been well trained. Albert assumed some of the supervisory functions. Mrs. Holt covered the kitchen side. The various daily duties were redistributed. The footmen picked up the carrying duties that had been coordinated by Mrs. Pratt and did so with varying degrees of grace. The one thing that was not immediately resolved was Thursday. Thursday was Mrs. Pratt's day. Thursday was the study. Albert recognized this problem at approximately 9 in the morning. He stood in the servants' corridor with his list of daily duties, which he had been managing since 7:30, and he looked at the entry for Thursday's study cleaning, and he looked at it for rather a long time. He was not a man who was comfortable with irregular solutions. He had held his position for 23 years by being the person who kept things in their correct order. The correct order said the study was to be cleaned on Thursdays, and that Mrs. Pratt cleaned it, and that this was how it was done. The correct order had not accounted for Mrs. Pratt being in bed with a fever. He called Owen into the corridor. Owen was 22 and had the expression of someone who was permanently slightly surprised by events. Albert explained the situation. Owen blinked twice. Albert asked whether Owen felt capable of undertaking the study cleaning on a one-time basis, with the keys being left in his care for the duration of the task. Owen said he supposed he was. Albert then spent 5 minutes explaining to Owen the standards of cleaning that applied to the Duke's private rooms, and Owen said he understood, and Albert was not at all convinced, but he had limited options, and so he gave Owen the keys and put his name on the study entry on the list, and went to attend to the 3 other matters that were waiting for him. Owen made it as far as the entrance to the servants' hall before he encountered a problem, which was George, the young footman who had taken Adele's bag on her first day, telling him that the wine delivery had arrived and needed to be checked against the manifest before it was moved to the cellar, and that this was something Albert had specifically said Owen was to handle. Owen looked at the keys in his hand. He looked at George. He then committed the small, casual error that would, in ways he would spend years not quite understanding, change the entire course of at least 2 people's lives. He went to the kitchen, found Adele at the table eating her quick noon meal, and told her that she was to do the study cleaning this afternoon and that the keys were on the hook in the corridor, and she should use the one marked with the letter S, and she should be done before 4 o'clock. Adele looked at him. He was already halfway back to the door. She looked at the table, she looked at the heel of bread in her hand, she set it down. She went to the corridor. She found the keys on the hook, she found the one marked S. It was long and heavy and dull with use. She held it in her palm and felt the weight of it for a moment. Then she put it in her apron pocket and picked up her cleaning pail and her cloths, and she walked to the east wing corridor, past her 6 rooms and her 12 windows, past the damp corner and the cracked wainscoting, all the way to the end of the corridor, to the door she had never been permitted to open. She stood in front of it. The corridor was very quiet, the frost was still in the air. The line of light was not there because it was afternoon and the fire had not been lit. The door looked exactly as it always looked, closed, old, waiting. She put the key in the lock. It turned with a heaviness that was satisfying in a precise and specific way, the way only old locks turn when they are well made, with a solidity that said this mechanism has been working for 100 years and expects to continue for another 100. The door opened. The room was not dark. 3 tall windows faced the south garden, and the afternoon light, pale as it was, came through all of them at a low angle that lit the room differently than a more direct light would have. The light was long and flat and moved across everything at a shallow angle that showed the texture of surfaces rather than their color. The desk, the books, the globe in the corner that was too old to be accurate, the fireplace with its gray ash from the previous fire, the chair, the lamp with the green glass shade, the side table, the pictures. She set down her pail. She was methodical by nature and by practice. She began at the door and worked inward, which was the correct way to clean a room. Never trap yourself against a wall with dirty work behind you. She dusted the wainscoting. She cleaned the windows one by one, watching the south garden become visible through the glass as she worked. She brushed the hearth and removed the ash and laid a new fire that would be lit by Charles in the evening. She polished the desk. She straightened the papers on it without reading them, which was both correct practice and personal preference. She cleaned the globe, which was covered in a fine layer of dust that was not the result of neglect so much as the result of the particular quality of old vellum, which held dust in a way that newer materials did not. She worked steadily and without haste for 40 minutes. She was almost done. She was cleaning from the door inward, and the room was almost entirely clean, and the last major surface remaining was the wall above the fireplace, which held a single large painting in a gilt frame that had dulled at the corners. She had not looked at it directly yet. She had been aware of it the way you are always aware of the largest thing in a room, but she had been working methodically, and the fireplace wall was last in the order she had set for herself. She turned to face it. The painting was a portrait, oil on canvas, 3 feet wide, perhaps 4 feet tall, a child perhaps 7 years old, a girl, dark-haired, wearing a pale dress that was not quite white, seated on a stone bench in a garden. The garden had an arbor at the left side of the frame, painted with the particular attention to light that meant the painter had been there at a specific time of day and had painted the light they actually saw rather than the light they imagined. There was a crack in the stone of the bench, visible in the lower left area of the canvas, where the painter had been precise about the details of the surface. The crack was in the second stone from the left of the bench. It ran diagonally, from the upper right corner of the stone to the lower left, with a slight curve at the lower end. Adele knew that crack. She knew it the way you know a thing that has been part of your body since before you were conscious of your body, the way you know the particular sound of your childhood home's door, the way you know the smell of a room you slept in before you had words for rooms. She had put her fingers in that crack when she was 5 years old, and her father had told her not to because the stone might be sharp and she might cut herself. And she had put her fingers in it anyway when he was not looking, because she had been a child who needed to touch things to understand them. The cloth dropped from her hand. It fell without sound on the old carpet at her feet. She stood in front of the painting, and the painting looked back at her with the face of a child she had not seen in 24 years, except in the occasional and unreliable geography of memory. Her own face, at the age of 7. In the garden of the house in Silesia where she had been born. The room was very quiet. The light came through the 3 south windows at its shallow winter angle and lay across everything, including her and the painting equally, making no distinction between them. She could hear from very far away the sound of the estate grounds, a cart on the road at the back of the gardens, birds, the thin winter wind against the stone of the house. She did not move for a very long time. She was not thinking. Thinking required a framework, a set of categories to sort incoming information into. She did not have a framework for this. She was simply standing in front of a painting in a locked room in the house of a man she had never spoken to, and the painting was of her, and she was trying to understand how that was possible, and she could not yet begin. The cloth was on the floor. She did not pick it up. She stood and she looked at the painting, and the light moved very slowly across the room in the way afternoon light always moves in winter, not dramatically, just the gradual reduction of its angle as the sun lowered behind the clouds above the south garden, and the room became slightly less bright and slightly cooler, and she stood in it. Eventually, she became aware that she was cold. Her hands, which had been warm from the work, had cooled. Her feet, in their working boots on the old carpet, were cold from the floor beneath. She picked up the cloth from the carpet. She looked at the painting for one more moment. The child on the bench with her dark hair and her chin slightly lifted, and the expression that her mother had once described, in the particular language of a mother who had loved her daughter very much and known her very well, as too much going on behind those eyes for someone so young. Then she turned, she picked up her pail, she walked to the door, she went out, she locked it behind her. She walked back down the east corridor, she put the key on the hook in the servants' corridor. She went to the kitchen and stood at the stone sink, and ran cold water over her hands for a long time. Then she went upstairs to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the bare garden below the window for the remainder of the afternoon. Maud found her there at 4:30. Maud had a practical relationship with other people's silences. She had grown up in a house where silence had been either comfortable or necessary, and she had learned early which kind was which. She knocked on the open door which Adele had not closed, and she looked at Adele on the bed and at the window and at the garden below it, and she said nothing for a moment. Then she said that supper was in half an hour and that Mrs. Holt had made a lamb stew, and that it was the good kind, not the one with too much onion. Adele said she would be down. Maud looked at her for another moment. She said, in the careful and non-invasive way that was her particular form of kindness, that the East Wing cleaning in December was hard work, harder than people who had not done it understood, and that it was perfectly reasonable to need a few minutes of quiet at the end of it. Adele said yes, she said she supposed it was. Maud nodded as if this was settled and went back downstairs. Adele sat for another 10 minutes. She was organizing in the methodical way her mind worked, the things she knew and the things she did not know and the gap between them. The gap was very large. What she knew was this: there was a portrait of her in the Duke's private study. It had been painted when she was 7 years old in the garden of her father's house in Silesia. The garden was unmistakable. The bench was unmistakable. The crack in the stone was unmistakable. She would have staked anything she owned on the certainty of it. She knew that the portrait was clearly not recent. The gilt frame had age on it. The canvas had the quality of a painting that had been in that room for some years. The dust on the frame, which she had cleaned carefully as part of her work, had been settled rather than fresh. This was not a painting that had recently been acquired. It had been there for a long time. What she did not know was why. The why was the gap. It was a very large gap, and she could see across it, but she could not cross it with what she currently had available to her. She needed more information, and she could not get more information by going back into the room, and she could not get more information by asking anyone in this house without revealing that she had been looking at something she had not expected to find, and that it had stopped her entirely, and she was not ready to reveal that. She was not ready for the conversation that would follow if she said, casually, to Mrs. Pratt or to Maud or to anyone, that there was a portrait of her as a child hanging above the fireplace in the Duke's private study. She went down to supper. She ate the lamb stew, which was indeed the good kind. She listened to Lucy describe a conversation she had had with the stable boy who had brought a message from the village, and who had apparently said something that Lucy was still not sure how to interpret. She listened to Owen complain at some length about the wine manifest, which had been miscount on 2 previous deliveries, and which he suspected was going to be miscount again. She listened to Albert say, in the tone of a man who has been in a position of authority long enough that he no longer distinguishes between giving his opinion and stating a fact, that the wine merchant had been unreliable for years, and that this was a matter that required the Duke's attention at the appropriate time. She said nothing. After supper, she went to the small room off the servants' corridor where there were 3 chairs and a lamp and a copy of last week's newspaper, and she sat in one of the chairs and she thought. She thought about Silesia, about the house there, which was the last place she had lived before Silesia became something that happened to her rather than somewhere she was from. She had been 9 when she left. She remembered the house clearly in the way that early memories were clear, not as sequences but as fixed images complete in themselves. The kitchen with its yellow tiles, the dog who slept by the front door, a large brown dog with a permanently anxious expression, the garden with the stone benches and the arbor. The garden where the portrait had been painted. She remembered, now that she was trying to remember with the specific focus of finding something rather than simply recalling, that there had been a painter. She had a clear image of him because he had been interesting to her as a child, a man with a very neat beard and a large hat that he wore indoors as well as outside, which she had found amusing. He had come in the summer. She had been made to sit on the bench in the garden for the portrait, and she had been told to sit still, which had been difficult because of the crack in the second stone, which she always wanted to put her fingers in. She did not know if she had managed to sit still. She could not recall the finished painting. She did not know what had become of it. She had been 9 when she left Silesia, 2 years after the portrait was made. She had been taken to the Voss family in Prussia in the autumn of the year her mother died. Her father had come with her to the Voss house and had stayed for 2 days and then left and had not come back. She had waited for a long time for him to come back. She had eventually stopped waiting, not because she had given up hope as a conscious decision, but because at some point she had realized that hope required maintenance and she did not have the energy for it. The Voss family had been neither cruel nor particularly kind. They had been practical. She had been given a room, clothing, food, and education of a functional sort, and in exchange she had been expected to contribute to the household from a young age and had done so without complaint because complaint had seemed, from the beginning, beside the point. She had taken their name because it was easier than explaining, every time someone asked, the name she had been born with. After a while, the name she had been born with began to feel like something that had happened to someone else, a person she had been before the person she became, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she did not resent this as much as she perhaps should have. She had left the Voss household at 19. She had worked in various houses since then, mostly in Prussia and then in England after she came to England, which she had done at the age of 27 for reasons that were not, if she thought about them now, entirely clear to her. She had thought perhaps that England was different, that it was a different kind of place. She was not sure she had been right about that. She had been Adele Voss for 23 years. She had not thought about her birth name in a long time. She was thinking about it now. Hargrove, Adele Marguerite Hargrove. She had been born in Silesia to an English mother and an English father who had gone to Silesia for reasons she had never been fully told, and she had been there until she was 9. She sat in the chair by the lamp. The Hargrove name was not one she had thought about in years. She had not thought about it because there had been no practical reason to think about it. It belonged to a life that had ended when she was 9 years old, and she was 32 now, and there was a considerable distance between 9 and 32 that had been filled with other things, other names, other houses, other windows to clean. But there was a painting of her at 9 years old in the private study of a man named Edmund Hargrove. She sat with that for a long time. She was a woman who preferred to have complete information before making decisions, and she did not have complete information now. She had a fragment of something very large, and she could see that it was large, but she could not see the shape of it yet. She needed to think. She thought. By the time she went to bed, she had organized what she knew into what she could use and what she could not, and she had made certain decisions about what she was going to do and what she was not going to do. She was not going to go back into the study uninvited. She was not going to mention the portrait to anyone in the household. She was not going to do anything hasty. She was going to find out, through whatever careful and patient means were available to her, who Edmund Hargrove was and what his connection was to the name she had been born with and to the garden in a house in Silesia that no longer existed in any life she currently lived. She was good at finding things out without appearing to look for them. She was going to use that skill. She lay in the dark in her narrow bed, and the house settled around her, and outside the window the frost was back, the same frost that had been in the ground for weeks, and she looked at the ceiling for a long time and thought about a child sitting on a stone bench in a garden, and about a crack in a stone, and about how a painting could travel farther than the person in it. She was not going to panic. She was not going to do anything rash. She was going to be careful and methodical, and she was going to find out what she needed to find out. She had always been patient. She was going to need every bit of that patience now. She began in the house's own records. She did not do this by going to the records directly. That would have been too visible, too pointed. She did it sideways, the way she did everything, by making herself useful in areas that happened to be adjacent to what she needed. There was a small library on the ground floor, separate from whatever the Duke kept in his study. It was a working library, the kind of room that held estate accounts and local records and bound volumes of correspondence going back to the family's tenure of the land. It was accessible to senior staff for legitimate purposes. Mrs. Pratt used it regularly for the estate accounts that fell under her management. Albert used it for the same reason. Adele offered, on a Tuesday morning in the second week of December, to help organize the shelving in the library, because it had become clear that a volume of the household accounts from 2 years prior had been misfiled, and Mrs. Pratt, when she was well enough to be consulted on the matter, said it was probably in the wrong section and that someone should look for it. Mrs. Pratt, still recovering from her fever, said this from her bed with the gratitude of a woman who was not yet well enough to do tasks herself, but was well enough to be irritated by them remaining undone. Adele said she would look. Mrs. Pratt gave her the relevant details. Adele spent 2 days in the library. She found the misfiled account volume in 4 hours. She spent the remaining time doing what she had actually come to do. The library had a biographical reference section, standard volumes, county families, titled families, genealogical records for the nobility and the gentry. She did not take any of them out. She consulted them where they stood, which was slower but less visible, and she found what she was looking for in an unremarkable grey volume titled Cheshire Families and Their Histories, published 30 years ago. The Hargrove family entry was 3 pages. She read it twice. Edmund Hargrove, 4th Duke of Cheshire, born 1826. No wife, no children. The entry noted a younger sister named Catherine Hargrove who had married a man named George Whitmore in 1851 against the wishes of the family and had subsequently lived abroad. The entry noted, in the terse language of a biographical volume that was not particularly interested in family conflict, that Catherine had been removed from the succession following this marriage, and that her connection to the family estate had been severed. Catherine Whitmore, née Hargrove. The mother Adele remembered had been called Catherine. She closed the book with great care and put it back exactly where it had been. She stood in the library for a moment with her hand still on the spine of the book. Then she went back to the misfiled account volume and carried it to Mrs. Pratt's room and put it on the table beside her bed, and said she had found it on the second shelf from the right in the wrong section as suspected. Mrs. Pratt thanked her. Adele said it was no trouble. She walked back down the corridor and around the corner and stopped in the cold space beside the linen cupboard where no one could see her, and she stood there for exactly long enough to allow the shaking in her hands to stop. Then she went back to work. The name Catherine meant nothing to Albert. It meant nothing to Owen or George or Lucy. It would have meant something to Mrs. Pratt, possibly, but Adele had no intention of finding out what Mrs. Pratt knew, not yet, not until she understood what she was dealing with well enough to know what questions to ask without giving herself away entirely. She needed someone outside the house. She thought about this for 3 days. Who she knew in the surrounding area was limited because she had been in the house for 6 weeks and had been to the village only twice. She knew Harold the cart driver who had brought her from the station. She knew Dr. Parks who had come for Mrs. Pratt and whom she had passed in the servants' hall on his way out. She knew by sight the butcher's boy who brought deliveries on Mondays and the woman who came to help with laundry on Wednesdays, whose name she had not learned. None of these people were useful for what she needed, which was historical information about a family that had been in the county for generations. Then she thought about the church. She had not been to church since her arrival because Sunday services required walking to the village, and she had been using her Sunday afternoons for rest, which she needed, and for the kind of private thinking that required not being surrounded by the sounds of other people. But a church kept records, baptisms and marriages and deaths. A church in a county family's territory would have records going back to the 17th century. And a church had a vicar who knew the families and the families' histories, and who was, by the particular nature of the job, unlikely to find it suspicious that a person wanted to know about local history. She went to church on the first clear Sunday of December. The church was small, as she had expected. Stone, like everything else in this part of the county, with a square tower and an ancient cemetery that sloped down the hill to the east. Inside it was cold in the way of English country churches in winter, a cold that no amount of heating would ever fully address because it was stored in the walls and in the flagstone floors and in the centuries of damp that the stone had absorbed. The vicar was a man named Reverend Philip Gray, perhaps 55, with a mild face and the particular warmth of someone who had spent decades being professionally kind to people, and had eventually found that it came naturally. The service was short and competent. Adele sat in the back. Afterward, she lingered. She looked at the memorial plaques on the walls with a genuine interest that she did not have to perform, because memorial plaques in old churches always contained information, and information was what she came for. The Hargrove family had an entire wall. 4 generations of them. The oldest plaques dated from the 1690s. The more recent ones were from within the last 50 years. They were formal, as such plaques always were. Names and dates, and in some cases a brief description of service or character. She found what she was looking for on a plaque that was newer than the others. White marble with clean lettering. Catherine Eleanor Hargrove Whitmore, beloved daughter and mother, born 1830, died 1877. Below it on the same plaque, smaller letters. George Henry Whitmore. Her husband, born 1821, died 1878. She looked at those dates. Her mother had died in 1877, her father in 1878. She had been 9 in 1877. Her father had taken her to the Voss family in 1877 and died the following year. She had not known he was dead. She had not known he had been brought here. She had not known they had been brought here, both of them, to a church in a county she had not come to until she was 32, and had come to entirely by accident. Entirely because a woman she did not know had taken a housemaid position in the county and had needed a reference for her, and she had needed to go somewhere. She stood in front of the plaque for a long time. Reverend Philip Gray appeared beside her with the quiet care of a man who had spent decades recognizing when someone needed to be approached gently. He asked if she had found what she was looking for. She said she was interested in local families. She said she was new to the area. He said the Hargroves had been in the county for a very long time. He said they were one of the oldest families in the area. He said the current Duke was the last of them as far as he knew. She asked if there had been any other family members. He said there had been a sister. He said this with the slight adjustment in tone that people use when speaking of something they know is sensitive, a slight gentling of the delivery. He said the sister had married outside the family's wishes, which was an old story, unfortunately, in families of that kind. He said she had lived abroad for many years. He said she had come back to the county when she was ill, which had been a decade ago now, and that she and her husband both were buried here. He looked at the plaque. He said it was a sad thing, to be separated from your family for most of your life over a disagreement. Adele said yes. He said he believed the Duke had arranged for the burials himself, that he had paid for the plaque, that whatever had happened between the family, the Duke had brought his sister home at the end. Adele said that was kind of him. The Reverend said he thought so too. She thanked him for his time, and she walked out of the church into the cold, clear air, and down the path between the old graves and out through the iron gate to the road, and she walked the 1.5 miles back to Asheville Manor without looking back at the church even once. She had answers now. Not all of them, but enough to understand the shape of what she was standing inside. The Duke of Cheshire was Edmund Hargrove. His younger sister Catherine had married a man named George Whitmore and been cut off from the family. Catherine Whitmore had died in 1877. George Whitmore had died in 1878. Both were buried in the local church. Catherine Whitmore had been Adele's mother. George Whitmore had been her father. Which meant that Edmund Hargrove, the man in whose private study a portrait of her hung above the fireplace, was her uncle. She walked the 1.5 miles back to Asheville in the winter quiet, and she thought about this very carefully, step by step, the way you think about a thing that is too large to hold all at once. She thought about the fact that he had brought her parents home to be buried here. She thought about the portrait, which had been painted in the garden of her parents' house in Silesia in the summer she was 7 and which now hung in a locked room in this house, which meant he had it, which meant someone had sent it to him or he had retrieved it, or her parents had brought it here with them when they came back ill. She did not know which of these things was true. She thought about the searches. Had there been searches? Had anyone come looking for her after 1877? Had anyone tried to find out what had happened to the child of Catherine and George Whitmore? She did not know. She had been in a house in Prussia with a family named Voss, and no one had come and no one had written and no one had found her in 23 years. She walked through the gate of Asheville Manor and up the gravel drive and around to the servants' entrance. She hung her coat on her hook. She went upstairs to her room. She sat on the bed. She had the information she needed to understand the situation. Now she had to decide what to do with it. This was, she thought, looking at the bare December garden below her window, the most important decision she had ever faced. She had made difficult decisions before. She had made decisions that required courage and decisions that required patience and decisions that required giving up things she wanted for the sake of things she needed. But she had never made a decision that could change her entire life in either direction. She could do nothing. She could stay at Asheville as she was, clean her 6 rooms and her 12 windows, live in this small room with the bare garden outside, and carry this knowledge alone for as long as she stayed here. She could leave Asheville and find another position somewhere else and never think about this again. She could convince herself that what she had found out was interesting but irrelevant to the life she was actually living, which was a practical life that had nothing to do with families or inheritances or old portraits in locked rooms. Or she could find a way to tell the truth. She sat with that for a very long time. The afternoon light failed. The garden disappeared into the early winter dark. She heard the household sounds below her, the kitchen preparing for the evening service, Owen's footsteps on the back stairs, the distant sound of Albert giving some instruction to George that George would execute adequately rather than correctly. She thought about Edmund Hargrove, a man who had brought his estranged sister home to be buried in the church of the county they had grown up in. A man who kept a portrait of his niece above the fireplace, in a room he locked against his own household staff. She thought about what that meant. She thought about it for a long time. Then she made her decision. She would not go to him. She would not write him a letter or ask for an audience or do any of the things that would put her in the position of making a claim, of presenting herself as something she could not yet prove she was. She would wait. She would wait for the right moment, the moment that made sense, that did not seem engineered, that arose naturally from the circumstances of the house rather than from her own calculation. She was good at waiting. She had been waiting in one way or another for 23 years. A little longer would not break her. She got up from the bed and washed her face at the ceramic basin and straightened her dress and went downstairs to dinner. The moment she had been waiting for did not come the way she had imagined it. She had imagined it as something that she would recognize in advance, a situation that would present itself clearly and allow her to step into it with some degree of preparation. She had imagined it as something she could control. It was not those things. It was a Tuesday morning, 3 days after Christmas, and she was on her knees in the east corridor wiping the wainscoting because the frost had been particularly bad the night before and the damp had seeped through in several new places. She was working quietly in the way she always worked, methodically, from the door inward, and she had been at it for perhaps 20 minutes when she became aware that there was someone at the far end of the corridor. She looked up. The Duke was standing at the entrance to his study corridor. He had clearly just come from the direction of the main staircase. He was wearing his morning coat and carrying the book he almost always carried, and he had stopped when he saw her because she was between him and the door he was heading for. He looked at her. She looked at him. She said good morning and began to move her pail to the side of the corridor to clear his path. He said good morning. He did not immediately walk forward. He looked at the corridor and then at her and then at the wainscoting she had been cleaning. He said, in the tone of a man who had noticed something without meaning to, that the damp was getting into the lower boards again. She said yes, she had noticed it. She said the cold weather always brought it in. He said that was true. He said it had been a problem for as long as he could remember. He said his mother had complained about it in the winter. He did not seem to find this remark significant. It was simply a statement of fact, the kind that came out naturally when you were standing in a corridor that had been part of your life since childhood. He said it the way you say any true thing without thinking about it first. She stopped moving her pail. She said, very carefully, that it must be strange to look at the same problems in the same walls after so many years. He said it was strange in the way that most things about getting old were strange, that you could not always tell, looking at a thing, whether you were still seeing it or only remembering it. She thought about that for a moment. She said she understood that. He looked at her. It was a brief look. The kind that comes when something someone says is slightly more than you expected from the context, but not so much more that it requires comment. He said yes, he supposed she did. He said good day. He walked forward and she moved out of his path and he went to his study and she heard the key in the lock and the door open and close. She knelt on the cold corridor floor and looked at the wainscoting. Her heart was working harder than the morning warranted. That was the first real conversation she had had with him. That was also, she realized, the most time she had spent in proximity to a man who was, if everything she had found in the library and in the church was correct, the only living family she had. She thought about what he had said about his mother. He had said it without any awareness that the woman he was speaking to had a mother too, his own sister, the woman on the plaque in the village church with the white marble and the clean letters. She went back to wiping the wainscoting. She was not going to do this today. She was not ready and the circumstances were not right. But she thought as she worked that things had shifted slightly, not dramatically, but slightly. She had had a conversation with him that had not been purely functional, not purely the exchange of a household employer and his servant. He had said something real and she had answered it honestly and he had noticed the honesty, even if he did not know why it was there. That was something. She built on some things. She had been building on some things her whole life. January came. Mrs. Pratt returned to full health and to her duties with the tightly wound energy of a woman who had been kept from those duties longer than she was comfortable with and intended to make up for it. The Thursday study cleaning returned to its usual arrangement. Adele returned to her 6 rooms and her 12 windows. But she had been in that study, she knew the room now. She had cleaned it and arranged it and felt the weight of its contents. And she had something she had not had before the week of Mrs. Pratt's illness, which was a name for what she was looking at. Edmund Hargrove was her uncle. She worked at Asheville through January and into February with the same consistency she had brought to every other position she had held, and she was good at her work, and the household noticed this, and valued it in the unspoken way that households valued reliable workers, by giving them slightly more responsibility over time, by trusting them with adjacent tasks, by directing new arrangements to them rather than to the less reliable. Mrs. Pratt gave her additional responsibilities in the East Wing. She gave her the morning room key, which meant Adele was responsible for keeping it in order and for its occasional use by the Duke, which was still rare but had become slightly less so in the cold months. She gave her responsibility for the landing lamps on the east staircase, which required careful maintenance because the oil had to be precisely leveled or the flame ran uneven. Adele did all of this well. She also, in February, had 3 more conversations with the Duke, not in the way she had engineered, simply in the way that happened when you moved through a house for long enough that the rhythms overlapped. He was coming from the morning room one afternoon when she was going into it to reset the fire. He was at the end of the east corridor one evening when she was coming back from the staircase lamps. He passed her in the kitchen passage once, which was unusual because the Duke did not typically use the kitchen passage, and she had the impression that he had used it that day by accident, getting turned around in a part of the house he rarely navigated, though she did not look at him long enough to be certain. In none of these meetings did he do what she had half expected him to do, which was return to the same brief and functional mode. He exchanged small remarks. He commented on the weather, once on the state of the morning room fire, once on nothing in particular, just a slight nod and a good evening that was one shade warmer than a purely functional exchange. She thought about this. She thought about a man who had commissioned a search for his lost niece for years, according to what she had later learned, and who had found nothing. A man who had brought his sister home to be buried and had paid for the plaque, and who sat alone in a locked room with a portrait of a child who had been that sister's daughter. She thought about what it meant to carry a loss for 23 years without resolving it. She understood that, in a way, she had not permitted herself to think about for a long time. She was 32. She had been alone since she was 9, not in the way of someone who had no people around her. She had always had people around her, the Voss family, the staff of the houses she had worked in, the general human proximity that came from shared spaces and shared work. But she had been alone in the way of someone who did not belong to anyone, who was not claimed, who existed without the network of names and history that most people moved through the world within. She did not, as a rule, think about this. But she was thinking about it now. She was thinking about it because for the first time in 23 years, she was standing in proximity to the possibility of not being alone in that particular way. and the proximity of the possibility, the mere fact of it, was doing something to her that she did not entirely have language for. She was careful. She had learned to be careful about things that she wanted very much, because wanting things very much had a way of distorting how you looked at them, making you see possibilities that were not there, making you miss warnings that were. She was being very careful. And she waited. The conversation she had with Charles, the Duke's valet, was accidental in the purest sense. She had not sought him out. She had not planned it. She had been going to the linen cupboard on a Thursday afternoon in late February, and he had been coming from the opposite direction, and they had nearly walked into each other in the narrow space at the corner. He apologized, which was his nature. She said it was perfectly fine. They stood in the narrow corner for a moment with the slight awkwardness that came from two people who had never properly spoken now being placed in close physical proximity. She asked simply to fill the space how Mrs. Pratt was finding the cold. He said Mrs. Pratt was finding the cold exactly as she always found it, which was something to be managed rather than complained about. She said that was very much Mrs. Pratt. He said it was. She made to continue to the linen cupboard, and then, because it was available and she might not get another chance, she said something she had not entirely planned to say. She said that she had found the library very useful for the household accounts. She said there was a great deal of family history in those volumes. Charles looked at her. She kept her expression easy. He said yes. He said the Hargroves had been in the county for a very long time. He said the records went back considerably. She said she had noticed. She said it must be a responsibility carrying that kind of history. Charles looked at her for a moment with the eyes of a man who had been observing people for a very long time and did not miss things. He said the Duke felt the responsibility deeply. He said this in the careful way of a loyal employee saying something true without saying more than was appropriate. She nodded. She said she was sure he did. She went to the linen cupboard. But she felt, walking away, that Charles had looked at her in a way that was slightly more alert than a brief corridor exchange warranted. As if she had said something that triggered a recognition he was not quite ready to name. She filed that away. She thought about it later and decided that either Charles was more perceptive than she had given him credit for, or that she was less careful than she believed herself to be. She resolved to be more careful. She was not yet ready for anyone to start asking questions. She was not yet ready for any of this to come to the surface in a way she had not prepared for. She needed to be sure. She needed to be completely sure of what she intended to do and how she intended to do it. She went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed. Outside the window, the late February sky was doing the thing it sometimes did in the last week of February, showing a thin line of something that was not quite spring, but was the memory of the possibility of spring, a lightening at the horizon that the summer seemed to promise from very far away. She looked at it. She was going to have to do something. She was going to have to tell someone the truth. The question was how and when and to whom. She was still working out the answer. March came in with a warmth that surprised everyone. The first week of March, the grounds began showing green at the borders. The kitchen garden, which Adele had watched through her window all winter as a rectangle of frost-covered bare earth, produced its first pale shoots at the edges where the wall kept the worst of the cold off. Mrs. Holt, who knew the garden the way she knew her kitchen, said it was early and that they might still get a late frost, and she said this with the satisfaction of someone who prefers to manage expectations and was not wrong to do so. Adele noticed the change in the light. She noticed it the way she noticed everything as information, as something the world was giving her that had not been available before. The mornings were longer. The east wing windows showed a different quality of light from the ones she had been cleaning all winter, a light that was warmer and came in at a higher angle and showed the rooms in a different way. The morning room in particular, which faced east, became briefly beautiful in early March, filled with a clear pale gold light that lasted perhaps 40 minutes before the angle changed, and it became ordinary again. She was in the morning room on a Friday morning in the second week of March when the Duke came in. He did not see her immediately because she was at the far window and the light was behind her. He came in with his book and his morning coat, and he had taken 3 steps toward his usual chair before he stopped and saw her. He said he was sorry. He had not known anyone was in the room. She said she was nearly finished and would be out of his way. He said there was no hurry. He sat down in his usual chair. He opened his book but did not read it. She continued at the window, finishing what she was doing, taking her time because she had a few minutes left, and because being the person who rushed out when the Duke came in was not a position she wanted to establish. After perhaps 2 minutes he said, without looking up from his book, that the east windows were better in the spring. She said she had been thinking that. He said the house had been designed with the east aspect in mind. That the person who built it, his great-great-grandfather, had believed that the best light was morning light, and that east-facing rooms should be lived in before noon. She said it was a good philosophy. He said he had never been sure if it was wisdom or simply preference that got called wisdom, because it came with money attached to it. She stopped at the window. She looked at him. He was still looking at his book, but with the look of someone who was aware that what they had just said was slightly more than ordinary. A dry remark, a small irony about the way inherited things got inherited uncritically. He was 61 years old, and he had been living in this house his whole life, and sometimes the observations that came out were the ones that had been sitting in him for a long time and came out sideways when he was not attending. She said she thought there was something in both, that good instincts and good fortune often arrived together, and it was difficult to separate which one you were grateful for. He looked up from his book. He looked at her for a moment, not the brief functional look, a slightly longer one. He said that was a sensible way to think about it. She said she found it useful anyway. He looked back at his book. She finished at the window and gathered her things and said good morning and walked to the door, and at the door she paused, because this was the closest to the edge of what she was prepared to do, and she was still not sure and she knew that, and so she made herself pause and ask herself honestly whether she was ready. She was not entirely ready, but she was ready enough. She turned back. She said, in a voice that was steady and clear and not apologetic, that she hoped he would forgive her for saying something that was not strictly within the arrangement of her position. He looked up again. He looked at her with the attention of someone who had just been told that something unusual was about to happen and was giving it the consideration it deserved. He said he would hear it. She said she had found, when she was cleaning the study in December, while Mrs. Pratt was unwell, that the study contained a portrait of a child in a garden that she believed she recognized. He was very still. She said the garden was in Silesia. She said the bench had a crack in the second stone from the left. She said the child in the portrait was approximately 7 years old and had dark hair and had been painted in the summer of 1854. The morning room was very quiet. The light was doing its brief daily thing, the pale gold coming through the east window and laying across the floor between them. He said nothing. She said she had been born Adele Marguerite Whitmore, that her mother had been Catherine Elena Whitmore, née Hargrove, that her father had placed her with a family in Prussia named Voss when she was 9 years old and had died the following year. The Duke of Cheshire put his book down on the arm of his chair. He looked at her. She met his look without flinching because she had rehearsed this moment many times in many ways, and the thing she had always come back to was that it had to be done without flinching. Whatever the outcome, whatever he said or did not say. He said, in a voice she had not heard from him before, that she had been in this house since October. She said yes. He said she had been cleaning his rooms and lighting his fires, and she had known, since December, what she was. She said she had not known how to say it. She said she had not wanted to say it without being certain of the information she was working from. She said she understood that this was not the way such a thing ought to be said, and that she was sorry for the manner of it, if not for the saying of it. He stood up. He was taller than she always thought from a distance. Standing in the morning room in the March light, with his book in one hand and the other hand at his side, he was simply a tall old man who had just been told something that had rearranged the furniture of his entire life. He said her mother's name. Not as a question. As a fact he was checking, a fact that had been in him a long time and that he was now holding up against what she had just said. She said yes, Catherine. He said Catherine had a daughter. He said the searches he had conducted had found nothing. She said the family she had been left with had changed her name to Voss. She said she had lived in Prussia until she was 19 and had come to England at 27. She said she had not known, when she took the position at Asheville, where she was going. She said she had not known the name of the county or the name of the family. He looked at her. He was not a man who cried, she could see that clearly. He was a man who had contained things for a very long time and had become so practiced at it that it was now simply the way his face worked. But there was something in his expression that she had not seen there before. Something had shifted. Some layer that had been load-bearing for a very long time had moved. He said he needed to sit down. She said of course. He sat. She stood by the door in the pale morning light, and she waited, and she let him have the time he needed. He sat in his chair in the morning room that his great-great-grandfather had designed for morning light, and he looked at the floor in front of him for perhaps 3 minutes. Then he said he would need to contact his solicitor. She said she understood. He said there would need to be verification, documentation. He said he was not saying this because he did not believe her. He was saying it because this was the kind of thing that required to be done correctly. She said she agreed entirely. She said she would provide whatever she had. She said she was aware that what she had was not extensive. He said that his solicitor would know what to look for. She said very well. He looked up at her. He said her name, not Adele Voss. He said Adele, and then he stopped because there was a second name available to him, and it was the one she had been born with, and it was not something to say quickly. She waited. He said Adele Whitmore. She said yes. He said that was a very large thing to say in the middle of a Friday morning, in the morning room. She said she supposed it was. He said he had not expected this day to be the kind of day it was turning out to be. She said she had not either. He looked at her for a moment with the careful, measuring look of a man who was going over the things she had said and comparing them to the things he knew, and she watched him do it without interrupting. She could see him finding the pieces, the way you find pieces when you are looking for them with the right knowledge. The dark hair, the angle of the chin, the expression. He said she had her mother's eyes. She felt something move in her chest that she had not permitted herself to feel for a very long time. She said she had been told that. He said Catherine had the same thing, that look. Too much going on behind the eyes for someone so young. He said their mother had said it about Catherine when Catherine was a girl. He said he had always found the phrase exact. Adele stood in the doorway of the morning room, and the light from the east window was warm on the floor between them, and she was 32 years old, and she had been waiting, in one form or another, for this moment since she was 9. She did not cry. She had not expected to, and she did not. She simply stood there and let the moment be what it was. He said he would send for his solicitor in the morning. She said yes. He said she should continue her duties until things were clarified, if that was acceptable to her, because disrupting the household's routine before they had certainty seemed premature. She said that was perfectly acceptable. She said she had been managing her duties for 6 months and could manage them a while longer. He said he knew she could. There was a silence that was different from the previous silences in the conversation. This one was not the silence of someone working out what to say next. It was the silence of two people who had just said the important things and were still in the same room and did not yet know what the grammar of being in the same room was supposed to be now. He picked up his book. She said good morning. She left. She walked the length of the east corridor to the servants' wing, and she stood in the servants' hall with its empty chairs and its smells of breakfast and soap and old wood, and she put her hand flat on the table and held it there. The house was around her, all of it. The rooms she knew, and the rooms she had been forbidden, and the grounds beyond the windows and the road that led to the village with the church, and the plaque with the clean letters, and the old cemetery on the hill. She held her hand flat on the table and she breathed. Then she went to do the rest of her rooms. The solicitor's name was Mr. Arthur Finch, and he arrived from Chester on the Monday following Adele's conversation in the morning room. He was a precise man of perhaps 60, with spectacles that he wore on his nose but that he frequently removed to clean, which he did with a small cloth he kept in his breast pocket. He had the slightly compressed quality of a man who dealt in facts, and found the areas between facts uncomfortable. He had been the Duke's solicitor for 20 years. He had drawn up estates, managed investments, handled the correspondence of 3 county councils, and managed the Duke's attempts to locate his niece, which had been a matter he had worked on intermittently for the past 16 years with no result. He looked at Adele across the Duke's study desk with the spectacles on his nose and an expression that was carefully neutral in the way of a man whose job required him to have seen a great many things and to have opinions about none of them. He asked her to tell him what she knew. She told him in order from the beginning, which was the garden in Silesia and the portrait and the painter with the large hat. She told him about her mother's death and her father's grief and the Voss family in Prussia and the change of her name. She told him about England and the positions she had held and the letter that had brought her to Asheville, which had been written by a woman named Mrs. Elizabeth Hartley, who had employed her for 2 years in Derbyshire and had then moved abroad for her husband's health and needed to give up her household. She told him about the study and the portrait. She told him about the library and the church. She told him all of it, carefully in order, without embellishment. He listened with his spectacles on. He took no notes during this account. He asked no questions until she was done. When she was finished, he removed his spectacles and cleaned them. He said he would need time to verify what she had said. He said there were several pieces of documentation that would either confirm or not confirm the account she had given. He said the most important of these were the original records from Silesia, which would include the record of her birth, and the records from the Voss family, and whatever records might exist from the time of her mother's return to England. He said he was familiar with the name Whitmore. He said the Duke had provided him with a comprehensive account of his sister's marriage and her years abroad, which he had used as the basis for the searches he had conducted. He said the searches had been frustrated primarily because the child had been placed with a family under a different name, and in a country where the communication of such records was not straightforward. He said, in the careful tone of a man who had seen many things and intended to give this thing the fairness it was due, that the account she had given was internally consistent and contained details that matched the information he already held. Adele said she was glad. He said he would also need to speak with her former employer, Mrs. Elizabeth Hartley. He said he understood she was abroad, but that communication could be arranged. Adele said she understood. He said the process would take some weeks. He said the Duke had asked him to proceed as quickly as thoroughness would allow. She said she appreciated that. He replaced his spectacles and looked at her again with the careful neutrality of a man who was doing his job and doing it well. He said there was one other matter he needed to raise. She said of course. He said that regardless of the outcome of the verification, the Duke wished her to know that she was no longer required to maintain her duties in the East Wing, that she was to be given a guest room in the main part of the house and was to be treated as a guest of the estate while the matter was being resolved. She looked at him for a moment. She said she would prefer to continue her duties. He blinked. She said she was not trying to be difficult. She said she was saying it because it was true. The work steadied her, and the household routine gave her structure that she found useful, and the disruption of moving to the main part of the house, while things were unresolved, would be, in her assessment, more unsettling than helpful. He said he would convey this to the Duke. She said thank you. He left. She went back to the East Wing. Maud found her at the wainscoting again that afternoon and said nothing about the solicitor's visit, which meant she did not know, which meant Albert had also not been told, which meant the Duke had handled it with the same discretion he handled everything else. She was grateful for this. She was not ready for the household to know, not yet. The knowledge that she carried was still raw at the edges, still new enough that it needed to be held carefully. She had told one person, and that person had sent for a solicitor, and the solicitor was now working, and things were moving forward, and all of this was happening in the correct sequence, and she needed it to continue to happen in the correct sequence without disruption. She wiped the wainscoting. She thought about what Mr. Finch had said about the records. She thought about the records she knew existed. Her birth had been recorded in Silesia. She did not know the name of the church or the registry, but she knew it had happened because her mother had spoken of it, had told her once, in the matter-of-fact way that mothers told these things to children old enough to understand them, that she had been born in the church of St. Clare in the town of Casso in the autumn of 1855. She thought about the Voss family. She thought about what records they would have. She had not been formally adopted. She had been placed, and the distinction was important because a placement was a practical arrangement and a formal adoption was a legal one, and she had never been told that anything legal had been done. She had simply been there, and then she had grown up, and then she had left. She thought about whether the Voss family would remember her. She had left 13 years ago. The family had been practical people without particular emotional investment in her presence or her absence. They would remember her, but whether they had records of her arrival or of the arrangement her father had made was another question. Her father. She had not thought very much about her father during these weeks of careful analysis and patient waiting. She had thought about him as a fact. He had died in 1878, a year after her mother, and he was buried in the church in the village, and his name was on the marble plaque. She had processed this as information. But he had also been a person. He had been a person who had carried her to a house in Prussia and left her there and died the following year, and she had spent 23 years not knowing whether he had meant to come back and simply been unable to, or whether the leaving had been the thing he meant to do. She did not know which of those things was true. She was not sure it mattered in the way it once would have. She was 32 years old, and she had built a life on the foundations available to her, and the life she had built was functional and capable, and she did not require his answer to continue living it. But she would have liked to know. She finished the wainscoting and stood up. She would perhaps never know that was true. But there were things she was going to find out and things she was not, and she had learned over many years that you could not mourn the second category while the first was still available. She went to do the windows. The weeks that followed were the most peculiar of her life. She had lived through peculiar things before, but they had been peculiar in the way of hardship, in the way of loss, in the way of difficulty that required her to become more compressed, to take up less space, to make herself smaller and more efficient. This was peculiar in a different direction. This required her to expand into something she had no training for. Because the Duke did not wait for the solicitor's report to begin treating her differently. He did it carefully, without announcement, without making it obvious to the household. He did not summon her and tell her things had changed. He simply behaved as though they had, in the small and deliberate ways of a man who had decided something and was acting on it without requiring permission from the situation. He left the morning room door open when he was in it. This sounds small. It was not small. It meant she could see him from the corridor when she passed, and he could see her, and sometimes he looked up and sometimes he did not. But the door being open meant that the option of the meeting existed rather than the door determining that it did not. He stopped walking past her in the corridor with the brief acknowledging look. He stopped and made brief conversation. He asked once whether the damp corner in the east wing had improved with the warming weather. He asked, another time, whether she had found the village church interesting when she had visited, which was the only indication he gave that he knew she had been there and when. She answered him honestly and without unnecessary words, because those were the parameters she had always operated in, and she was not going to change them simply because circumstances had changed. He seemed, in some way she could not precisely describe, relieved by this, as if he had expected her to become a different person and was pleased to find that she had not. She thought about that. She thought about what it was like to meet a member of your family for the first time when you were both already fully formed people, with your characters already made and your habits already set, and how different that was from the way family was supposed to work, which was from the beginning, when you could still be shaped by each other. They were not going to shape each other, they were already who they were. But there was, she discovered, something in simply being in the same rooms as someone who belonged to the same original story as you, something that did not require words or family history or documentation, something that was simply the fact of shared origin, of coming from the same source, which was a kind of recognition that did not need to be spoken. She felt it when she passed him in the east corridor. She thought he might feel it too. She was not going to ask him. Some things were too delicate to survive being spoken directly. The solicitor's letter arrived in the 3rd week of April. It came addressed to the Duke. He read it in the study alone as he did everything. She knew it had arrived because Charles mentioned it in the careful roundabout way that Charles mentioned things in the servants' hall. He said a letter had come from Chester. He said the Duke had received it after breakfast. He said nothing else. She went about her day. That evening at 5:30, Charles appeared in the East Wing corridor and said the Duke would like to see her in the morning room when she was available. She said she would be there in 10 minutes. She finished what she was doing, she washed her hands. She straightened herself in the small mirror above her washstand and she looked at herself for a moment. She looked, she thought, like a woman who was about to go into a room and find out the shape of the rest of her life. She supposed that was accurate. She went to the morning room. The Duke was standing at the window. He had the letter in his hand. He turned when she came in. He said, "Good evening." She said, "Good evening." He said he had the solicitor's initial report. He said it was not complete, because the records from Silesia would take more time, but that the report confirmed the information that was already available. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartley had been contacted in France, and had confirmed that she had employed Adele Voss for 2 years, and had provided the reference letter, and that in the course of that employment, certain information had come to her attention, which she had noted but not shared with Adele directly, because she had not been certain it was her place to do so. Adele looked at him. She said, "What information?" He said that Mrs. Hartley had known the Hargrove family, that her own family had been acquainted with the county families, including the Hargroves, and that she had seen Adele and had been struck by a resemblance that she could not account for. He said Mrs. Hartley had, apparently, written the reference letter in part because she was trying to arrange a situation where the resemblance might be noticed by someone who would know what it meant. Adele stood in the morning room and thought about Mrs. Hartley. She thought about the woman who had employed her for 2 years in Derbyshire and who had given her a reference that directed her toward Cheshire. She thought about whether the reference had been designed or whether it had been, as she had thought, simply the letter of a former employer who happened to know of an available position. She thought about the things that could be both at once. She said she had not known that. He said he did not think she had. He said the solicitor would continue with the formal verification, and that the process would take some more time, but that he was satisfied, in the way that mattered to him, which was not the legal way but the other way. She said she understood. He said he wanted her to have the east bedroom on the 2nd floor. He said he would ask Mrs. Pratt to make the arrangements. He said he recognized she had declined this before, but that he was asking again. She looked at him. She said yes. He nodded. He stood at the window and she stood by the door, and the evening light was different from the morning light, lower and warmer, and coming from the west now, and it made the room look different from how it looked in the morning. He said her name, Adele Whitmore. He said it the way you say a thing you have been saying in your mind for a long time, and are finally saying out loud. She said she had been Voss for a long time. He said she could be whatever she wished. He said names were the beginning of a conversation, not the end of one. She thought that was well said. She said good evening. She went to the servants' wing one last time and began to arrange the small number of things she had to arrange. The east bedroom on the 2nd floor had windows that faced both east and south. In the mornings it had the same light that the morning room had, the pale gold that the great-great-grandfather had designed for, and in the afternoons it had the longer light from the south that made it warm in a way the servants' room had never been. There was a fireplace that worked properly, there was a writing desk, there was a wardrobe that had room in it for more than 2 dresses. She unpacked her bag for the last time in the small room on the 3rd floor. 2 dresses, sewing needles, the cracked leather bag, the letter from Mrs. Hartley, which she now read differently, which she now read as the letter of a woman who had seen something and had done the only thing she could think to do with it, which was to create a situation and hope. She picked up the bag and the 2 dresses and the needles and the letter, and she carried them to the east bedroom, and she put them away in the wardrobe and on the desk. And she sat down in the chair by the south window, and she looked at the grounds below, the south garden and the border with the early spring flowers, and beyond it the long path that she had watched the Duke walk from the morning room window in October, when she had been new and had not yet known what she was watching. She sat there for a long time. The house was quiet in the way it was always quiet in the mid-afternoon, the particular settled quiet of a large house between its activity, between the morning work and the evening service. She thought about Mrs. Hartley. She had written to her that same evening, a brief letter that said very little but said it directly. She had thanked her and she had told her that things were being resolved, and she had said she hoped the spring was fine in France. She had said she was not certain whether what Mrs. Hartley had done was kindness or something more complicated, but that she was grateful regardless. She had not sent that letter yet. She was still deciding what she actually wanted to say. She thought about what she wanted to say to a woman who had seen a resemblance and had written a reference letter to an estate in Cheshire and had not said a single word to the person she was arranging this for. She thought about what it meant to make a decision for another person's life without asking them. She thought about whether she was glad or not. She was glad. She was completely, fully glad that she had ended up in this house and found that portrait and stood in front of it and understood what she was looking at. She was glad that she had had the months of careful waiting that had preceded the morning room conversation, because those months had given her time to be certain and to be ready and to arrive at the truth in the way that suited her, which was prepared. She was glad for all of it. Even the parts that had been hard, the years in the Voss house, the positions she had held, the rooms she had slept in that were not hers, the long practice of belonging to no one. All of it had made her the person who had come into this house with a cracked leather bag and a letter, and the particular patience of someone who had learned to wait without knowing what they were waiting for. She was that person. She was also, as of 3 weeks ago, Adele Whitmore, her mother's daughter, her uncle's niece, a person with a name that connected her to a story she had not been able to read since she was 9. She was finding out how to hold both of these things at once. It was not, she was discovering, as simple as she had thought it would be. She had imagined, when she had thought about this in the abstract during those long patient months, that the resolution would feel like arrival, like stepping into a room that had been waiting for you. And it did feel something like that, but it also felt like disorientation, like having spent so long moving that the stopping felt strange, like she was not quite sure of the ground under her feet even though it was perfectly solid. She was going to need time. That was all right. She was good at time. Mrs. Pratt came to see her on a Thursday morning. Not the Thursday of the study cleaning, a different Thursday, the Thursday after Adele had moved into the east bedroom. She knocked on the door with the precise, contained knock that was characteristic of her, and she came in when Adele opened it, and she looked at the room and at Adele in it, and she did what she always did with information that was larger than she had expected, which was to arrange her expression into something that held it without showing it directly. She said the room was in good order. Adele said she had tried to leave everything as she found it. Mrs. Pratt said that was sensible. There was a pause. Mrs. Pratt said she had been the housekeeper at Asheville for 26 years. Adele said she knew. Mrs. Pratt said that in those 26 years, there were very few things she had not been told directly that she had not nonetheless known about. She looked at Adele. Adele waited. Mrs. Pratt said she had known when she saw Adele's letter of reference that there was something in it she was not seeing. She said she had known, when Adele cleaned the study and came back with nothing broken and nothing commented on but nothing quite right either, that something had happened in that room. She said she had known, when the solicitor from Chester arrived, what it was in general terms, even before she knew the specifics. She said she wanted Adele to know that she did not have a complicated feeling about any of it. Adele looked at her. Mrs. Pratt said that families were complicated things. She said that long separations did not unmake families. She said that she had worked in this house long enough to know what Edmund Hargrove's relation to his sister's absence had cost him, which was quite a lot, and she said that a resolution, even a late one, was better than none. She said she hoped Adele would find the house comfortable. Adele said she thought she would. Mrs. Pratt said she would speak to the staff about the change in arrangements at a time that felt appropriate, if Adele was agreeable to that. Adele said she was grateful for it. Mrs. Pratt looked at her one more time in the way of a woman who was completing a long-running assessment and arriving at a conclusion that satisfied her. She said good morning. She left. Adele sat on the edge of the bed in the east bedroom and listened to her footsteps go down the corridor, precise and even and carrying their own particular weight. She thought that she liked Mrs. Pratt very much. She thought she had liked her from the beginning. The solicitor's full report arrived in June. By then the Silesian records had been located, with the help of a correspondent in Caso who had conducted the search on Mr. Finch's instruction. The church registry confirmed the baptism, the record named the parents, the record named the child. The dates aligned with everything Adele had provided and with everything in the Duke's own information. Mr. Finch came from Chester again and sat across the desk in the study, and laid the documents out in the careful order of a man who understood that documentation was not just proof, but ceremony, a way of making real what had been true for a long time but required formality to become official. The Duke sat on one side of the desk, Adele sat on the other. Mr. Finch explained each document. The Duke listened, Adele listened. At the end, Mr. Finch said the matter was confirmed and that the legal implications were straightforward. The Duke said he understood. Adele said she understood. Mr. Finch put the documents back in his case. He made 2 copies, one for himself and one for the estate file. He said there were further matters to discuss in due course regarding the Duke's wishes as they related to the estate and its management, but that these could wait for a separate meeting at a time of the Duke's choosing. The Duke said Thursday. Mr. Finch said Thursday it was. He left. Adele and the Duke were alone in the study with the documents and the old desk and the green glass lamp and the globe in the corner. She looked at the portrait above the fireplace. He looked at it too. He said the painter had been very good. He said his sister had commissioned the portrait herself, which he had not known at the time. He said it had arrived at Asheville among Catherine's effects, along with some other things, when the estate was notified of her death. He said he had not known what to do with it. He said he had put it in the study because it was the room he was alone in. She thought about that. She said she remembered the painter. She said he had worn a large hat indoors. He looked at her. He said, after a moment, that was the sort of thing you remembered about a painter if you had been watching him as a child who found large hats interesting. She said she had. He said Catherine had been the same way as a girl, that she noticed the things that were slightly wrong or slightly unusual about the world and found them worth paying attention to. She said she supposed that was something they shared. He said he supposed it was. She looked at the portrait, the child on the bench, the crack in the second stone from the left. The garden in Silesia that was gone now, the house sold long ago to people who had nothing to do with any of them. She looked at the child who had been her. She thought about what it meant to look at yourself from the outside, to see the person you had been before you became the person you were. She had thought in the months of waiting that seeing the portrait again after understanding what it was would be dramatic, would carry the weight of revelation. It did not. It was quieter than that. It was simply the particular quiet of recognition, of a thing confirming what you already knew. She knew that child. She had been that child and she had grown into someone different, and the growing had been done mostly alone, and had produced a person she was, on the whole, not unhappy with. She said the crack in the stone was still in her hand. He looked at her. She said that when she had been small she used to put her fingers in it, that the shape of it was still somehow in her memory in a physical way, not as a thought but as a sensation. He said some things stayed like that. She said yes. He said he had a thing like that about a particular gate at the east end of the grounds. He said he had not been able to open it as a child because it was stiff, and even now that it had been rehung and moved easily, he still expected it to be stiff. He said he always put too much force into it and it swung too wide. She thought that was exactly right. She said she understood that. They sat in the study with the afternoon light coming through the south windows and the portrait above the mantel looking at neither of them, looking the way portraits always looked, which was not at the room but somewhere slightly beside it. She thought about the document on the desk between them. She thought about what it was to have a name confirmed by a registry in a church in a town in Silesia that she had not been to since she was 9 years old. She was Adele Marguerite Whitmore. That was confirmed, that was documented, that was real in the legal sense that the world required. She was also Adele Voss. That was the name she had answered to for 23 years, the name she had learned to think in. The name that was in her body, the way the Voss family house was in her body, not a place she returned to, but a place that had made her. She was going to need to decide what she wanted to be called. She was not going to decide that today. The Duke asked if she would like tea. She said she would. He went to the door and called for Charles, and Charles appeared with his usual precision and received the instruction without visible surprise, which was, Adele thought, the mark of a valet who had already absorbed the situation and reconfigured his expectations accordingly. Tea came. She sat in the chair that was now, she supposed, available to her, on the visitor's side of the old desk in the locked room that had held her portrait all these years, and she drank tea with the last of the Hargroves, who was her uncle and who was a man she had spoken to for the first time 4 months ago, and who was, in the way that mattered, the only family she had. She thought that it was strange. She thought that most true things were. She took the name Hargrove in the autumn, not Whitmore and not Voss, Hargrove the original. She took it because it was the name on the wall of the church, her mother's name before her mother had given it up for love, and she thought that the name deserved someone to carry it since her mother had not been permitted to, and she was the only one available. She told the Duke over dinner on a Tuesday evening in September, the first year's anniversary of her arrival at Asheville, almost to the week. He looked up from his plate. She said she had been thinking about it for some time. He said it was a good name. She said she thought so. He said their grandmother had been a Hargrove by birth as well, and that she had considered keeping the name when she married and had decided against it and had regretted it, which was how such things often went. She said she imagined that was true. He said he was glad. He said it quietly, and he returned to his plate, and she returned to hers, and the dining room settled around them with its evening sounds, and its good fire, and the particular quality of a room that has been many things to many people over many years and knows, in the way that old rooms know things, how to hold whatever the people in it need it to hold. She was Adele Hargrove. She was 32 years old, and she had cleaned 6 rooms and 12 windows and 1 corridor, and had found herself in a room she was not supposed to be in, standing in front of a painting she was not supposed to see, looking at the face of a person she had lost track of when she was 9. She had been patient, and she was here. She ate her dinner. Outside the dining room windows, the grounds of Asheville Manor were going dark in the autumn evening, the same darkness that had been going down over these grounds for 200 years, the same stillness settling into the stone and the grass and the old paths between the borders. The gate at the east end of the grounds was closed. The kitchen garden was winding into its autumn quiet. The east wing was lit against the dark, its tall narrow windows warm with lamplight. She looked at the windows for a moment. She thought about the woman who had cleaned those windows, who had pressed her thumb to the left corner of the sticking frames the way Maud had showed her, who had knelt at the wainscoting in December cold and looked up at a line of light at the base of a door. She thought about how strange it was to have come from somewhere and to have lost it, and to have found your way back to it by the most indirect and accidental of routes, and to be sitting in the dining room of the place at the end of it. She thought about Maud, who still cleaned the east wing and who had never, in the months since everything changed, treated her differently in any way except that she was now Maud in both directions. That is to say, they had become something that looked like friends, which was a thing that Adele had not had very much practice with but was learning. She thought about Lucy, who had resolved the village boy situation in the way Maud had predicted, which was with the boy doing the predictable thing and Lucy recovering her fundamental cheerfulness. And then, to everyone's surprise including her own, meeting a different boy in the village who was not the predictable type at all, or at least not predictably in the wrong direction. She thought about Mrs. Pratt, who continued to run the household with the same tightly contained authority, and who had said nothing more about any of the larger matters since the morning she had come to the east bedroom, and who nevertheless made certain small adjustments in the household's daily arrangements that demonstrated, without requiring statement, that she understood the situation and approved of it. She thought about Edmund Hargrove, who was sitting across the dinner table from her and who was eating in the precise, unhurried way of a man who had eaten alone in this room for decades and was still adjusting to it being otherwise. She was going to stay at Asheville. She had already known this. She had known it from the moment she had said yes to the east bedroom, but she was thinking about it now in a different way, not as a decision to be made but as a fact that had already been made, that had settled into the category of things that simply were. She was going to stay. She was going to learn the house in the way you learned a house when you belonged to it rather than served it. She was going to learn which rooms she preferred, and which paths in the grounds she liked in which seasons, and whether the gate at the east end still swung too wide when she put too much force into it. She was going to take her time. Time was something she knew how to use. After dinner she went to the morning room, not because she had a reason to be there, simply because it was hers now, in the way that a room could be yours by inclination rather than ownership, and because in the evenings it had a different quality from its mornings, the fire going and the south window dark, and the lamp on the side table making a warm circle in the corner. She sat in the chair that was not the Duke's chair. She sat and she looked at the fire. She thought about the painting in the study, about the child on the bench, about what it meant that the painting had traveled from a garden in Silesia to a locked room in an English house and had waited there for 23 years, and that the person in it had traveled a different and considerably more complicated route and had arrived at the same address. She thought that it was not a story she could have told in advance. She could not have told it because the route it had taken was so particular, so specific to the accumulation of small decisions and misfortunes and accidental arrivals that had made up her life, that you could not have designed it, you could only have lived it. And she had. She looked at the fire. Outside the morning room the house was settling into its evening quiet, the sounds of the last duties done, the fires banked, the lamps turned low. The old stone doing what old stone always did in the cooling air, shifting and settling with sounds that were so familiar now that she heard them without hearing them, the way you stopped hearing the heartbeat of a place once you had lived in it long enough to belong to it. She belonged to it. She was, for the first time in 23 years, somewhere that she belonged to. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. She sat in the chair by the fire in the morning room of Asheville Manor, and the autumn dark was outside the windows and the house was quiet around her, and she had 2 dresses in a wardrobe upstairs, and a name that was hers again, and a portrait above a fireplace that was also, finally, exactly where it should be, which was in the same house as the person it had always been a painting of. She was patient. She had always been patient. Now she did not need to be. She sat and she watched the fire and she let the quiet be the quiet, and she did not go anywhere at all.